Before we begin our program tonight, we would like to acknowledge that the Black Loyalist Heritage Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people. We also acknowledge that Black people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent who came before us to this land. By the time our ancestors' arrival, this land had already been inhabited by the Mi'kmaq for thousands of years. The knowledge passed on to the Black Loyalists from the Mi'kmaq people was an invaluable tool to their survival here in Nova Scotia. So again, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's event. And my name is Cynthia Dorrington. I'm the site manager for the Black Loyalist Heritage Center, and I'm a proud Black Loyalist descendant. And I have the honor and the pleasure of interviewing Lawrence Hill this evening. Lawrence Hill is the award-winning and international best-selling author of 10 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the Book of Negroes, which was made into a 6-part miniseries, and The Illegal, both of which won CBC Canada Reads. His previous novels, Some Great Thing and Any Known Blood, became national bestsellers. Hill's nonfiction work includes Blood, The Stuff of Life, the subject of his 2013 Massey Lectures, and the memoir, Blackberry Sweet Juice, on being Black and white in Canada. On Tuesday of this week, HarperCollins Canada not only published but released the novel Beatrice and Croc Harry. Hill's volunteer work has included Crossroads International, the Black Loyalist Heritage Society, Black clubs from inmates and book clubs, for inmates, and the Ontario Black History Society, and Walls to Bridges, a nonprofit group offering university courses to incarcerated Canadians. He is a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph, who has spent more than a decade volunteering in book clubs in federal penitentiaries. In 2019, through Walls to Bridges, he taught a 3rd-year undergraduate memoir writing course to women incarcerated in the Grand Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener, Ontario. Currently, he is writing Screenplay for a TV miniseries in development, as well as a new novel about thousands of African-American soldiers who traveled from military bases in the Deep South to help build the Alaska Highway in northern British Columbia and Yukon during World War II. He is a member of the Order of Canada, and he lives in Hamilton, Ontario with his family. Any of you who visit the Black Loyalist Heritage Center know that the cornerstone of our museum is a digital copy of the Book of Negroes. Larry has been on the journey with us from the creation of the exhibit and truly is a lifelong friend of the museum. Welcome, Larry, and to tonight's event. And before we begin, knowing that you have the book, and everybody who has gone on the website, the book was released on the 11th of January. Can I ask you to read a passage of the book, and then we'll move into our questions. And I will ask if anybody in the audience has any questions, please feel free to place them in the question box, and we will ask those questions of Larry during the time frame we have with them.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that introduction. It's so nice to see you and to be here tonight. I really thank you for organizing this event. I thank you, Cynthia Dorrington, as well as Braden Chetwin, Kelly Davis, and the board of directors of the Black Loyalist Heritage Society. It's been quite a journey for me of friendship. I first came to the Black Loyalist Heritage Society around 2002 when I was beginning the research for the Book of Negroes, and we've been friends ever since, the people involved with the society and I, and it's such a pleasure to have this 20-year friendship and to renew it tonight with you. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank Mike Miller, a senior publicist at HarperCollins, and all the people at HarperCollins for being so incredibly supportive to me in bringing this book out and in supporting tonight's event. So I'm going to read to you just a paragraph that opens Beatrice and Croc Harry, just to give you a sense of the flavor of the book. As you'll see, it's about a girl who's lost, who awakens with amnesia, completely alone in a massive forest. She doesn't even know her last name. She doesn't know if she has family. She doesn't know why she's alone with no other human beings in this huge forest. Doesn't even know what year it is. And she doesn't even recognize right off the top that she's Black, as there are no other human beings to sort of remind her of her identity, either positively or negatively. She is alone. So initially, her identity in that respect doesn't matter. This is how it opens, with a chapter called An Awful Lot of Places for Something to Go Wrong. Beatrice was not entirely sure if she was dead. She raised 2 fingers to her lips and felt her own warm breath. She appeared to be awakening from a deep, dark dream in which she had either died or come close to it. As she opened her eyes and studied the circumstances, the facts confirmed that she was alive. She didn't know much, but she knew this. Her name was indeed Beatrice. It had a certain flow, 3 syllables, and never just 2. Thank you very much. And so that's how Beatrice and Croc Harry opens, with Beatrice awakening in a treehouse, stocked with food and books, but other than that, completely on her own in a massive forest, trying to reassemble her utterly lost identity.
Wow. And you have written books around identity, but just that opening really sets the stage. And I myself personally, it draws you into the book itself. So tell me, as you're an author and a well-renowned author, and I'm thinking, when we think of the questions asked to us, what do you want to be when you grow up? Author typically doesn't come to mind right away for folks. So with that being said, and I know both your mom and dad were authors, did they inspire you on this journey, or what inspired you to take this journey?
Well, they very much inspired me, Cynthia. I mean, in a sense, I owe everything to them. But they also, in certain respects, discouraged me. So it was a really interesting kind of tension between, and I think it's because, I mean, let's face it, my parents were immigrants. They came from the United States, African-American father who'd served in the US Army, in the highly segregated, Army in the Second World War. The son of an AME church minister. And my mother was a civil rights activist, white, who was very much active in this field before she met my father and married him in 1953 in Washington. And you know how it is. Immigrants, especially immigrants who are racialized, who are Black or from other countries, the last thing in the world they want is to see their kids become novelists. They're looking for doctors and lawyers, and who wants a kid in the arts? Heaven, no. I mean, enjoy a movie, sure. Enjoy a painting, go to it. But please don't think about a career in the arts. If you're the child of immigrants, that is not on. I can tell you that personally. And so on one hand, of course, they were telling us we had to become, us, my brother and sister and I, we had to become lawyers, doctors, engineers, architects, respectable things. You know how it is. There's a lot of pressure among Black children, I think, to conform in that respect and to look for secure places in society, in the economy. On the other hand, my father made me write letters for the things I wanted from my youngest childhood. And I had to write a letter at the age of 6 for a cat, which he didn't want to give me. And after 3 requests to have the cat, he made me write a letter for it and told me I'd get it if there were no spelling mistakes, and I executed a letter properly. And he gave me that cat after I wrenched this letter from my heart. And after that, I just hit him up with letters every time I wanted something. And so I became, I think, a novelist at the age of 6 after I wrote that first letter, because I was successful in getting what I wanted. So I just kept writing more letters. And honestly, I was so excited by that process and the power of my pen that I just kept writing letters, and that led to short stories and novels. And I've never really stopped. So somehow I knew by 6 that I had to keep pursuing this writing thing because it was working for me.
Well, it's interesting because although you were pursuing it, your undergrad degree was not in any type of writing aspect in any way, shape, or form. If I'm correct, it's economics, correct?
Yeah, and I loved economics, and I'm still interested in economics. I like math and calculus and statistics, and I like international and national issues that have to do with economic injustice. I'm very interested in justice and including economic injustice. I'm not so much interested in the detailed operations of how companies work, but I'm interested in economic issues writ large. And also writers come from all sorts of backgrounds. I mean, there are doctors and lawyers who are writers as well, who studied medicine but end up, primarily devoting themselves to literature, instead of law or medicine. And so lots of people develop in all sorts of unique ways. You don't just have to study writing, to become a writer. But I was writing and I was studying it on my own. I just wasn't being schooled in it. I was studying every day of my life how to write by all the reading and writing I was doing.
Well, we will continue to learn as you go along. So you're schooling and writing from the time you started at the age of 6, and very successful with those letters, shall I say, especially if you're able to talk your parents into getting a pet, right? So successful in writing those letters, that was fantastic. And migrating that into your everyday life. And this is who you are now. This is Lawrence Hill, the author. And it really is a statement that you can take a passion, something you thoroughly enjoyed, and migrate it into a profession. And when you talked
It's
about
a luxury.
exactly, when you actually spoke about immigrant parents and what they want you to be, we even know within the Black community, our parents want us to do better than them. And I know my parents did the same thing. So those fluff courses or university courses, make sure that when you walk out, you have a good paying job. So I can hear where and understand where your parents were at in wanting you to thrive in being a writer, but at the same time wanting you to be very rooted in you need a job in order to live. Now, as we go back, and I'm going to morph back into writing and thinking about that, typically, when there are books that we read throughout the course of our time frames, and we've probably read many, that really once the book is finished and you turn that last page, you're still dying to read more about the characters, about what's happening. And it's almost like it ends and it's almost like a loss. Can you share with us if you've read a book that you have gotten to that point where when you turn that last page and it's the end of the book, it's almost like a loss. It's like, what do you do now?
Well, sure. I feel that when I read, but I also feel that when I write, because when you come to the end of, say, it takes me sometimes 3 to 5 years to write a novel. And so, you're totally lost in this world that you're just making up in your mind. It is a pretty silly thing to do when you think about it. Spend years in your own head hoping that somebody might buy that story. It's pretty risky to spend all that time without any guarantee of success. At any rate, there's a bit of a loss even when you come to the end of the process as a writer, and sometimes a bit of grieving. But as a reader, I felt it many times. When I was a boy, to answer your question, Cynthia, I used to go to the Don Mills Public Library. Don Mills was a suburb of Toronto where I grew up, and in the early 1960s, and there was a library and also a bookmobile. And I fell in love with these books by Beverly Cleary called Henry Huggins. And I was always dying to get another story about Henry Huggins and his dog Ribsy. And I think one of the stories was called Henry and Ribsy. And I felt such loss at the end of the stories. And I just raced back to the library, just desperate to get another book. And I was so sad when I came to the end of the series and there were no more Henry Huggins books to read. I was so invested in those series. But even today, I mean, if I read a great book, it's troubling and sad to come to the end of it, because it's kind of like a friend that's waving goodbye. And a good book is a bit like a friend if it kind of wrestles inside your skin and lodges there with your heart. And so you keep it, but it said goodbye because you turned the last page. So I experience that, still today.
I think, like you, I experience it each and every time I read. I got into reading when I was a youth, so basically around the age of 10, 11. And sometimes that was your escape when you were reading, because and I'm very much a picture person when I read. I know that there are some people that are really fast readers, and when you ask them to describe the book to you, they can't. They read so fast. They never formulated those pictures. And I'm one of these ones that I formulate the picture. So when I read a book, I can, over the time frame reading the book, and then even thereafter, I can talk about the book and what happened, the journey of that book, the people in the book. So I'm really very much in descriptors, and I love people that really focus on that description and really emphasizing it so you can actually see it. And some of your books are very much like that. When I read the Book of Negroes, that is very much like you're picturing, you're part of the book and you're picturing everything around it. Can you share with us when you did that book and just the thoughts around it, like why the Book of Negroes? What drew you to that subject? And then from there, I'd like you to think about when you took that and finished the book and you moved it into a screenplay, because moving from a book to a screenplay are two totally different types of writing. So share with us, first of all, what drew you to write that book?
Sure. What drew me to write the Book of Negroes, and then how
Mhm.
about adapting it and writing the screenplay? And by the
Exactly.
way, in terms of picturing books, I couldn't draw to save my life. Cynthia, if you asked me to draw a cow, I swear you would not recognize that cow on the page if I tried to draw it. Truly, I have the drawing ability of maybe a 2-year-old. But I do, there's something I do all the time when I read, and maybe it's my way of processing images. I doodle. I just doodle constantly. I'm always doodling on a piece of paper while I'm reading. And I don't know if you're like that or not, but my hand is always moving, doodling, or maybe scribbling stuff in the margins of a book. So when I finish a book, it is destroyed because I've written all over it and doodled and everything, but it's kind of my way of engaging with the process. But as for the Book of Negroes, um, my parents, Daniel G. Hill and Donna Hill, they were civil rights activists. My father basically created and led was the first leader of the Ontario Human Rights Commission as its director and later chairperson. They co-founded the Ontario Black History Society. They both wrote books about Black history in Canada, but they didn't really know much about and didn't ever speak to me about the Black Loyalists. That was not a story that was central to my childhood, but there are many, many other aspects of Black history in the world and in Canada and in the United States that I did hear about, not the Black Loyalists. But they had a book on their shelves called The Black Loyalists by James Walker, a prominent historian who'd written this book, A Scholarly History of the Black Loyalists. It came out around 1977. So I think Walker was one of the very first to write extensively in a scholarly way, an entire book about the Black Loyalists. And so, and again, many books have been done since then, but he was one of the first, again, around 1977. And I found that book on my parents' bookshelves when I was a young man. And I took it with me. I just pilfered it from their shelves because I'd sometimes visit home, take one of the books, go off with it, and maybe not return it and read it. And I read the book and I was so fascinated to discover this aspect of Black history that I'd never heard about before. And that was that, when the British were trying to win the Revolutionary War, they draw formerly enslaved peoples into the fight to try to defeat the rebels. And of course, they lose the war and the rebels win and go on to form the United States. So the British, as a reward to former enslaved peoples who served them in the war, the American Revolutionary War, they bring them over as Black Loyalists to Nova Scotia, in 1783. And that's the first massive wave of Black people into Canada, even though we've been here since the early 1600s. This is the first massive wave. And then, of course, they're so mistreated in Canada that many of them voluntarily leave about 10 years later and sail in 15 ships from Halifax on January 15th, just 2 days from now, 1792, to form the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone. And so the story was just so compelling to me, and it presented an aspect of Black history that I hadn't known about before, that I just started digging and digging and digging. And I just had to tell a story about a woman who's on one of those ships leaving Halifax January 15th, 1792, and sailing to Sierra Leone to insist on her freedom because she hasn't fully received it as it had been promised in Nova Scotia. And so she, like many others, was born in Africa, enslaved, hauled across the ocean in chains, and manages to get back to Africa, before she dies. And this is a story that was so compelling to me that I just had to write a novel about it. So that was sort of the origin point of the Book of Negroes, and I just had to write a woman's story and to sort of hang a story on her shoulders and tell her moving through this tumultuous journey of freedom in Africa, and then enslavement, and then freedom again, in the New World, and then returning to Africa before she dies.
Wow, it is amazing. I've had the journey of being in Ghana, and I went to a slave castle. So your book comes to mind when I was there and going through that experience. And that experience was a very phenomenal to me experience. It caused me to have this time frame in my life that I actually had to reflect on who I am and my roots and what I want to be and what I want my life to serve from a legacy perspective. And it causes you to think. And it took me about 4 days to really reflect on that particular experience. When I read your book, and then I moved into the miniseries and watched the miniseries, I was just drawn to it. And I empathized with her. I was with her on the journey. And it caused me, when I went to the slave castle in Ghana, it caused me to say, my gosh. And I relived sort of her journey and getting into this castle and then leaving this castle and migrating into the United States. So again, from looking at it from that perspective, it causes you to think not only the amount of work and time it took you to prepare for this book, because there is a lot of research you have to do, but then working from that lens and being a male and working from a female lens, it is, you have to be more creative in how you actually depict things. So now, when you moved it over to a screenplay, like you just can't arbitrarily take a novel and just move it right across. There's a lot of things you have to adapt. How easy was that adaptation from a novel to a screenplay?
Well, it was very challenging. It was incredibly exciting, but it was challenging. First of all, it's a totally different form of writing. So I was a co-writer. I wrote the screenplays along with the director, Clement Virgo. So we co-wrote the miniseries. And it was a new thing for me. I'd written I'd written a film documentary about the history of the Black Church in Canada. But other than that, it was called Seeking Salvation, a history of the Black Church in Canada. But other than that film documentary about the Black Church, I'd never written for television, before.
Mhm.
And I certainly had never written drama. And so I had a huge learning curve. It's a challenging thing to write a screenplay, especially when you're starting. But I was grateful to learn as I went and to be paid, for the work as well. And it was thrilling to be part of a team. Now, when you are writing a screenplay, I can assure you, even though the screenplay is based on your own book, you are the least important person in the room, and you better understand that fast. There are the directors, the producers, the stars, Ingenue Ellis and all the other American and Canadian, stars who are acting in it, and the investors who are spending millions of dollars. You are like a little ant in the production. Even as a writer, you are the least important person in the room, and it's really important to swallow your ego and just work with people and be part of a team. So the biggest difference was, when I write a novel, every mistake is mine, and if there are any little victories on the page, they're mine too. But in a screenplay, you are part of a huge team, and you just are working collaboratively with other people, and your work's going to be jerked around and changed and pulled and stretched, and you're going to argue, and you're going to lose a lot of fights, and it's just the nature of the beast. And so you're a small player in a big process. It's a multi-million-dollar, multi-year process. I didn't have to do the hard work of producing it. That's up to the producers. I just had to write it, which was already a lot of work. It was thrilling. It's challenging. Things come up that you never think about as a novelist. For example, if I'm writing a scene in which there's an uprising on a slave vessel, a vessel that's taking enslaved Africans across the ocean. When I'm writing this story about that uprising on the vessel, well, I just write the story. That's all I have to do. But when I wrote it into the screenplay, one of the first comments was, "We can't film that. It would cost too much. You know how much it costs to film film a ship on the water and film a lot of people on a ship in the ocean? Like, that's too expensive." And so you're running into budgetary issues. You're running into more complex moral issues such as nudity. I mean, in a novel, you can say that a child as my protagonist was naked when she was hauled from her village and forced to walk 3 months overland to the ocean and enslaved there. But you can't show that on TV. First of all, it's against the law, and second of all, it'd be immoral. And even if it weren't against the law, and even if it weren't immoral, it would totally hijack the emotions of the viewer, and you'd never get past that awful image of, say, a naked child being forced to walk for months across the continent of Africa. And so you have to adjust things profoundly in order to make them work on TV. It's not a simple thing, it's quite complex. And also, a little bit of violence goes a long way on screen, and you can actually get away with more of it on the page than you can on the screen. And so I had to really tone down the violence and let a little bit represent what everybody knew was the bigger picture. You don't have to shove it all in the viewer's face. A little bit says a lot. And so there are huge adaptations to make. We took a lot out of the story, but we also added a lot, including in the Nova Scotia section. There are a lot of parts to the Nova Scotia section of the miniseries that were new, that I wrote into the story that had not been in the novel, because we needed more story going on, more drama, more struggle in the Nova Scotia section of the novel. So there's a lot that we took out, but there's also a lot that we added. For example, I wrote much more about the anti-Black riot that took place in Shelburne in the 1780s. Much more about that in the screenplay than we did in the actual book.
Wow, it's amazing, because if people don't know, they think it's pretty simple, but that is itself. You have to be humble when you're doing that aspect of it. It is not your whole creation. It is a creation of a team, as you said. We do have a question from the audience. I have a question from, well, first of all, Vanessa Banfield. She actually is looking forward to purchasing the book and been reading it to her boys. So hopefully she can give us some feedback on that later on. Also, Susan Hickey is asking, would love to read the book, but what are you reading now? Like, what book are you reading right now?
Well, right now I'm reading a book that I'm going to blurb, a book by a Mexican Canadian short story writer, for which I'm going to write a blurb. I'm not at liberty to mention it yet because it's not published yet. But I read a lot of different things. I read a lot of factual material, whether it's historical or biological, like even for Beatrice and Croc Harry. It's a story about a girl and a crocodile, and a very testy relationship that she has with this 700-pound crocodile. And even though it's a fantasy, and of course there's all sorts of made up things, like the crocodile is packing a PhD vocabulary and is a high talking crocodile with lots of fancy words at his disposal. Even though that's true, I still had to research a lot about crocodiles and learn all sorts of fascinating things about crocodile biology just to put the book together and to make it interesting and to insert interesting facts about crocodiles amidst the fantasy. So some of my reading is just factual or historical, biological, medical, whatever. And then of course I read lots of fiction because I love fiction. And I also read a lot of newspapers and magazines because I used to be a journalist. I'm a bit of a news hound still. So my reading is quite eclectic: fiction, nonfiction, historical materials, and of course the news. But all of it feeds into sort of propelling me forward. Much of the reading is research, for the books I'm writing, and currently writing a book about the Alaska Highway building. I'm reading a lot about the Black soldiers who built that highway in the far north of Canada in 1942-43. So the reading's pretty mixed.
Very eclectic. I do have a question from Catherine Winkler. And the question is, do you believe that the 15 ships to Sierra Leone will one day have equal footing in history and monumental to the Halifax explosion and the sinking of the Titanic? What will it take? How do we make it a historical moment or something in history that is going to be instrumental or inspirational? People will know about it.
It's a great question. I sure wish we could get there. I've been trying. I've been trying so hard. And one of the ways I've tried is to popularize that history by writing a novel about it. And I love books of history. I read them all the time, and I love books of journalists. I was a journalist myself in a past life with the Globe and Mail and the Winnipeg Free
Mhm.
Press. I used to be a reporter. But sometimes the best way to capture somebody's heart and kind of awaken their imagination and help them really see and understand something is through story and allowing them to imagine a person's struggle through a major historical event. So I tried really hard to popularize the story of that migration on January 15th, 1792, from Halifax to Sierra Leone with 15 ships carrying 1,200 Black men, women, and children, a third of whom had been enslaved and taken from Africa. A third of them are going back to the continent from which they were ripped a long time earlier. And so it's a phenomenal story. And it's the first time in history that a large number of people of African descent are returning to the mother continent. It's not happening from the United States or from Jamaica. It's happening from Canada. And that's the first back to Africa migration of any substance in history. So I hope that it becomes enshrined in our schools and in our ways of understanding ourselves. We have a long way to go, but I'm trying hard. And one of the ways I try to do so is to write fiction and popularize it that way. Even Beatrice and Croc Harry, this novel that's just come out, is an attempt for me to resuscitate and revive the Canadian imagination about our past. Because although it's not written on the page, Beatrice and Croc Harry is a very playful novel for children and adults, really, but it's an allegory. It's a story about the aftershocks of the transatlantic slave trade and what happens to people who are divorced from their past. And like people who are hauled across the ocean in chains and their descendants who have no way of knowing concretely about their language and their culture and their religions and where they came from and their homes, and they're divorced from their past completely, Beatrice is also divorced from her past through no fault of her own and through an act of violence. She has been excommunicated from the human race and sent off to this forest. And she has to make her way back if she can to understanding who she is and where she comes from. And her journey is very African in its essence. And although these issues aren't spelled out on the page for children, the concept is embedded in the story because Beatrice, like the descendants of those who were enslaved and hauled across the ocean, has been divorced utterly from her past, so much that she doesn't even know her last name or anything about where she comes from. And she's trying desperately to find out. And that journey, of course, is the stuff of the novel. And so even this novel, Beatrice and Croc Harry, with lots of shafts of light and playfulness and humor, is
Mhm.
my effort to continue to engage the Canadian and the world imagination about the effects in the aftershocks of the transatlantic slave trade and about Black history in the world and in Canada.
I think really people like yourself and other playwrights or writers have to really focus on this history and write about the history, because if we're not doing it, who is doing it in our absence? And I think it has to be a voice of African ancestry that tells the story, because sometimes we don't. If you don't have that understanding, it's almost like nothing about us without us. They have to have our sense, our identity, understand who we are. Thank you for answering that question. I have another question from Louise DeLille, and she's very happy to meet you via video, of course. She is a Black playwright, and she is asking, how would you suggest we can encourage more of our people, being people of Black ancestry, to try their hand at the written word to tell their stories? So it's really, how do we promote storytelling? We've done it, our ancestors have done it for years, but how do we get people to do it in a way that's meaningful?
Such a great question. How do we promote storytelling and writing and the expression of the arts? It's quite similar to the question, how do we get our children reading? Because both of those things are often lodged in childhood. And as I mentioned in the beginning of our talk, Cynthia, my initial propulsion toward writing is not because somebody said, "Thou shalt write." It's because I just had to write this letter from my father if I wanted a kitten, and I wanted that kitten so bad that I just poured my heart into the letter, and got the kittens or just kept writing. And so how do we get our children writing and expressing themselves? And I must say, it is a challenge. Like, I'm a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph, which is a university in Southern Ontario. And most of the Black students that I meet, and I'm active in supporting Black students and a supporter of the Guelph Black Students Association and so forth. Most of the Black students I meet on campus, they are not in the arts. They are studying science or, you know, um, pre-medicine courses. They're really driven into areas that they think, well, business, economics, things that they think will be practically useful to them. And it's rare that I find a Black student taking a course in creative writing, or in English, which to me is lamentable and really sad, because I think that one of the first challenges we face in becoming writers is overcoming this perception among our parents that it's somehow wrong to envisage a career in the arts. I say you only live once. And if you have a passion and you don't go for it, you're almost violating your own inner constitution. You're almost disrespecting yourself, and you will find a way. I had to, often that means working on the side, having other jobs. But if you are interested in the arts and you want to make it your life, you will find a way to make it work. You might have to hustle and work a lot and lose a little sleep and have a job or two on the side, while you're developing your art, but you'll find a way. So I think being involved in the community, expressing ourselves, getting out there, meeting with Black children and other children and encouraging them by showing them what we do and demystifying it. I'm just an ordinary guy. I've got 5 kids. I was raised in Toronto. I've often been to Nova Scotia, but my kids certainly don't think of me as being anything other than kind of an ordinary dad and an ordinary person, which I am. And so part of the job is to demystify the arts and to bring artists in contact with children so they can see, oh, he can paint. Well, I can too. Or she can write a play. Maybe I can try that too. Oh, that's what's involved in doing a screenplay. Well, I'd like to give that a try. And so mentorship and role models and just kind of introducing people to the fact that these forms of work are no more bizarre than becoming a firefighter or a doctor or a teacher. You just have to imagine it and give yourself permission to go for it. So those are some of the things that are involved. But I think the essence is starting with children, in kindergarten and grade 1, introducing them to the love of story, the love of making story, and to the diverse voices in this country who are making stories. Let's face it, some of our most successful writers are Black, in Canada today.
That's so very true. You have to get them engaged at a very young age. And I think because there's a point in time that once they reach that age, they're not engaged, they probably won't be engaged, right? So,
and I should just add, if I may, even in terms of engagement, part of engagement is play, is just having fun and playing with language and telling stories to your children, reading stories, but also telling stories and allowing children to enjoy the revelry, the silliness, the absurdity, the fun of language. I mean, how do you be a writer without playing with language? And so I tried to insert a lot of language play into Beatrice and Croc Harry. There's a dictionary called the St. Lawrence Dictionary of Only the Best Words Real and Concocted. A lot of invented words in the book, like goozalum and willy lump lump and crocohypoliterasis. But there are also real words that are kind of absurd or antique or barely used, but quite silly and overblown. And so I play a lot with language, not just because it entertains me, but because I'm hoping that children too will respond to the play of language in the book and will enjoy and laugh along and find it entertaining to see and to sort of see how absurd and ridiculous and entertaining language can be.
And I think as adults, we help formulate that idea of reading and actually help build the love of reading. I remember I can go back to my childhood and my sister, I have a younger brother, and my sister is 4 years older than I am. And what's interesting is as we were doing housework or dishes in particular, drying dishes, she would tell my brother and I a story. So she was older, so she got to stay up and watch movies and we didn't. Or she was reading a book, and so she would take the book and tell us the story. But she would only tell the story if we continued drying dishes. So of course there was housework being done, but the thing is we didn't see it. So you had to visualize everything. And I think that's why when I started reading, I'm very much a visual reader because I had to visualize as she was telling the story, what was going on. So I had to visualize it in my mind. So
Cynthia,
I think
why didn't you tell me that story when I had young children? I would have used that technique myself. Thank you.
I know. I know. She got to listen. We had to do these chores, and she got a lot of it done. So I mind you, with my brother and myself doing a lot of it, but we did it. But it actually caused me to want to read, and so I really, some of the books that she was reading as I got older, I read them myself. So again, that we have to develop that passion in the children. And I think with Louise asking that question and your answer, it is really, we have to help develop that passion. They're not going to know, but we have to help develop it. And I think storytelling is a huge, huge one. Just another question in the chat line. There is a question from, I think her name is Dale Isleby. She says, Mr. Hill, please tell us about the research process in writing something this immense, being Beatrice and Croc Harry, because even some of the languages you're using is sometimes it's that dictionary of Beatrice and Croc Harry, but how did you imagine what you imagine and put it on paper?
Well, thank you so much. Is it Dale, the person's name?
Yes, it's
Thank
Dale.
you, Dale. Well, when I remarried, suddenly 2 new children came into my life as new daughters of mine, and they were 3 and 6 years old when they came into my life and lived with me full time. And I really wanted to bond with these new daughters of mine and make them fully integrated into this family. And suddenly I had 5 children instead of 3. And so, I mean, I love taking care of children, and I seem to be a natural father in that respect. But one of my tools was to tell bedtime stories. And I started telling bedtime stories to the youngest child in this new brood of 5, Beatrice, who was about 5 at the time that I started telling these stories. And one of the tricks in telling a story to a child is giving the protagonist of the story the same name as the child who's listening, but making them a little bit different. So so Beatrice, my child, was listening to me make up stories about Beatrice in the story, who was a little bit older and who was always fighting off the jaws of a crocodile. And every night, Beatrice, the character, would almost get eaten by this 700-pound crocodile, and just at the last minute, outfox the crocodile and live another day. And so these were immensely entertaining stories to my daughter about this girl always outfoxing a crocodile who was very hungry and was trying to lure her with fancy language and poetry and, poetic language. And as soon as she got close, snap, he'd try to have her for lunch. And so that was the origin of the stories. Stories I told, 15, 16 years ago to Beatrice, who's now, 22 years old and just graduated from university. I sat on it for some years because even though I'd promised that I'd write a book about this for Beatrice, I had some other books to write, some screenplays to write. It took me a while, but I finally came to it. And the imagination was so fun. I mean, in the normal books that I write, I'm not allowed to have a talking crocodile and a talking blue sapphire tarantula or a black lemur who's got a black identity, whose name is Killjoy. I'm not allowed to have these talking animals in yip-yapping away and having these fancy words to trot out, because it would just seem ridiculous in a literary novel for adults. But I was able to kind of break free of all those inhibitions and just go for it and go wild and be that dad telling a bedtime story that was wild and raucous and crazy and completely full of fantasy and hopefully enthralling a child. And so I guess the first job in writing was to go to that place where once again I felt like a bedtime storytelling dad and was just trying to be the most entertaining dad I could be at bedtime. And then, of course, there was a lot of research because even though it's a fantasy, I did have to learn a lot about forests and things that are in them. And did you know that some fruit trees can produce various fruits on the same tree? different fruits can be grown on grafted onto the same tree and they could survive. I've seen these trees, and I learned a lot about crocodiles, like they swallow stones to, digest their food. Those stones are called gastroliths, or they actually do cry. Crocodiles do cry. They have this nictitating membrane, and they cry to rinse their dry eyelids, when they're not in the water. And so I learned a lot about crocodile biology and also about tarantula biology and how tarantulas eat. Because there's a friendly tarantula who becomes Beatrice's dear friend. Her name is Fuzzy, a blue tarantula in the book. And so, yeah, I had to learn a lot about interesting aspects of biology in order to, make the story interesting. But it was great fun. I feel grateful. And I had a riot reading the story. I think I had more fun reading this novel than any novel I've written before, even though the themes are the regular, serious, painful, challenging themes of identity and the reconstruction of identity, searching for home, all the themes that have been central to all of my other books. They're still there, but I'm just playing with them in a more kind of highfalutin, silly, sometimes comic way.
But you're taking something and and actually, if you look deeper, it's almost like there's the story of Beatrice and Croc Harry, which is a bedtime story, but then you've taken that and you've taken it to another level. So when an adult, that's why it's a child adult read, because when an adult is reading it, you're looking at that depth of identity and who and what makes us who we are. And some of that time it's the people around us or the things around us, they actually help identify us or allow us to identify ourselves in our way of living and working and playing type thing. So
It's true. And it's a challenge. It was for me, at least. Like, as a writer, it is not easy to take a dead serious issue, but to find a way to write about it comically and with a kind of a light touch and to be entertaining, especially for children. It's a hard and tricky line to walk, a fine line to walk, to be funny, about painful things. But I say, why not? Humor is a saving grace, and being able to laugh at yourself, being able to be around the kitchen table and laugh about the absurdity of your own life, or even about your own failures, to be able to laugh about these things helps you stay healthy. It helps you stay alive. It's a vital coping mechanism, absolutely, in Black culture, but in many other cultures too. And so I was trying to embrace, really, in some respect, what I think is a hallmark of Black culture, which is the ability to mine humor, even as you're digging into deeply and hotly political and social and historic issues, to mine humor to address, pain. And that's hard to do, but I found it really exciting. And I loved the way the book was coming to me on the page. And I felt that in a way, the page met my soul. And my soul, because it was more playful and more bedtime storytelling, my soul was allowed to flower on the page more than, say, in the traditional book that I might have written.
and I think that is a really great segue when you think about it into how we write. And you talked about flowers, you talked about blossoming. Like that is it. Those are powerful words because as a writer, and I'm not a writer in any way, shape, or form. Uh, I listen when you talked about drawing or painting, and you don't do well. I don't do that writing side. I do business writing, totally a different concept. But that creative side, I probably don't have that writing technique. But it does take a lot to actually pull a character together. So even with Croc Harry, it's himself, the persona around Croc Harry. Basically, you are taking that story as a child's story, a bedtime story, and you're now personifying Croc Harry into the written word. So you're taking
Yes.
and you're making him larger than life. But as you said, there's a lot of research before you can make him larger than life on a piece of paper.
And to me, he's a really fascinating character. I love Croc Harry. He's a troubled being. He knows in his bones that he's done something wrong, but he doesn't know what it is.
Mhm.
And in a way, we are introduced to his humanity. I mean, he's a crocodile, but you know what I mean. We're introduced to his soul and his heart before we discover the wrongs that he has committed and the sins that he has perpetuated. And I like the idea of introducing somebody's humanity, so to speak, before we introduce the more negative side to their past and their history. And he's a tortured soul. He knows he's done something wrong, doesn't know quite what it is. His memory too has been erased. And I like the idea that Beatrice has to form an allyship. Really, she has to convert a predator, a
Mhm.
crocodile, a hungry crocodile, into an ally. And that's very difficult. But she's got to do that to survive, because she needs that crocodile. Because, in a way, he's going to save her life. Once he's no longer going to kill her, he's going to save her life, and she's going to save his. And they're going to work together, and as they need each other. And so I'm quite drawn to this relationship, and to Croc Harry, and to his high-powered vocabulary. So I really became quite drawn to that character, because he's a troubled soul. And that's the best kind of character to have in a story, somebody who's troubled and mixed up, who has a troubled past.
Yeah, I totally agree. Another question that's in the Q&A is basically the question is from Lana Shoop, and she is asking how much editing goes into manuscripts after they're submitted to the publisher, and is it a different now that from when you first started? So
How much
basically, from the time you started and sending them to the publisher to now.
Well, how much editing goes into publishing a book? A great deal in my case. I'm a fast writer. I mean, I was a journalist first, and I tend to just let the story erupt on the page in a very messy way in the first draft, because I want to give birth to a live beast. Doesn't matter if it's unruly and uncombed and messy and kind of out of shape. I want it to be alive and to have energy and to be dynamic on the page in the first draft. So it's messy, it's all over the place. There are parts that don't belong. It needs to be totally rewritten, but at least it got some form of life, that I've hopefully given birth to with that first draft. And then I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite till the cows come home. And so I write fast, and then I rewrite many, many times before I feel I've got a finished book. And the editor that I work with and others who advise me are very much engaged with that process. Once I've written a few drafts, I start showing it to my editor, and I think we went through easily 15 drafts of this book before I felt satisfied, and she did too. Suzanne Sutherland was her name. She was terrific, and she pushed me. She really drove me back to the page. You want somebody to push you. If you think that you can give birth to a perfect product, without any revision, that's no more, that's no less living in a pipe dream than say thinking you can go to the Olympics as a basketball player without ever practicing. Like, it just ain't gonna happen unless you're born with the genius of Mozart. It's not gonna happen. You have to rewrite your work over and over again, and so I do. And my work is worked on by editors and by me, just as much now as when I was beginning, because I'm becoming more ambitious and I still need help. I still need guidance. Every writer needs a good editor or a bunch of editors. And I've acknowledged the people who helped me in the back of the book. And there are many pages of acknowledgements. There was help from my wife and my children. There was help from my editor, my agent, and so many others who encouraged me and gave me information that I drew upon. And so I make a point of acknowledging them. And you'll see just how much work goes into writing the book like that if you read the acknowledgements at the back of the book. They're pages long.
It's almost like when I think about a book and the way you've described it, it's like going to an art gallery and looking at a picture, and the picture starts off being very vivid because you're putting the big colors on the page first. So that's almost like your fast writing technique that you're talking about. And then you're starting to really shape the people, the landscape, whatever it is, you're starting to shape it. So it's almost like now doing that editing and softening the story and putting more things into the story and making sure the story is robust. And then, of course, really now fine tuning it is really taking it and softening it around the edges and making sure that it's very clear and crisp. It's almost like it's an art in itself. But if you think about it in the analogy of a painting, it's very similar to when you're starting with painting it, and to get to the end result, what you put on paper. So if you watch a painter paint a picture, When he first starts painting, it's not the end result at all. So I look at that analogy because really at the end of the day, anything that we do, we have to start off someplace. So there's always going to be a starting point. There's always going to be a midpoint, and there's always going to be an end point. And at each of those junctions, you're going to find pieces of yourself in a different format, in a different way. And you're going to shape what's going to happen in those junctions just based on what's going on around you as well.
It's so true. If you were to look at my first draft and my final draft, the one that was published, there's a world of difference. It's not just fine tuning. I mean, I hauled stuff out willy-nilly, replaced stuff, rewrote stuff. There's entirely new stuff. A lot of stuff that was there originally is it's gone. It's a massive rewrite, you know, from beginning to end. And so that's how I work. And so to answer the question, there are many, many drafts and much editing is involved, and I'm very grateful for that. And the day you think you don't need an editor is the day you're going to start producing bad work, because you do need somebody in your corner pushing you like a coach. An editor is like a coach. Do better. You think you gave 100%? No, you gave 85%. Let's bring it up to 100. You can do better. You want somebody pushing you, just like a coach would push, you know, a sprinter in a race.
Exactly. Just as we're getting ready to wrap up, this hour has gone by so fast. But as we get ready to wrap up, first of all, I want to thank you, Larry, for sharing your thoughts on your creative side of who you are from the inside out, because really that what you're right on paper is that inside of you. It's that inspiration. It's that it makes you whole. As I look at the world, there's always pieces of us that are out there, and you're pulling it together. I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's the questions that people sometimes ask because it really draws on who you are as a person. But if you were looking at the various books that you read over time, and even looking at your own in that series of all those books, is there one book that has made you cry?
Yes, there were many. But the autobiography of Malcolm X really shook me up when I was 14 or 15 and wrote that. I mean, here's this man initially advocating that white people were the devil incarnate, that white people literally represented the devil. And I knew this couldn't be true. My mother was white, and I knew she was no devil. But the writing was so powerful, and I was 14 or 15 when I was reading this book, trying to make sense of this person, and so grateful that before he was assassinated, he came to a much more loving place where he no longer identified white people as devils and realized that many people could join in the struggle for, you know, for human rights and desegregation and freedom. And that book really upset me. Many books have brought me to tears. Anne of Green Gables brought me to tears. You know, the story is so beautiful, and the sadness is so rich and well wrought. Yeah, I am brought to tears by books for sure.
And I think sometimes that's the beauty of books. They make us laugh and they make us cry. And that's allowing our inner child to actually be who we want to be. So I love reading. It's a passion of mine. It's something that I encourage people. It doesn't matter the age. If they're too young, read to them. My nieces and nephews, their first year, especially for their birthdays and Christmases, they got books from me. I believe that children have to start, and the child's not reading at that time, but the parent. And I encourage my brothers to read to their children, because to me, that's most important. Allow them to allow their brain to think big. And so with this event, and I applaud you on Beatrice and Croc Harry. I know you do well. We are selling the book in our gift shop. So if anyone online would like to get a copy of the book, please go to our website, phone our offices. We're more than willing to do that. We have some information inside the book that you have signed, so you can get signed copies of that if you purchase the book as well. So I thank you for doing that. You are an amazing author, and I am so happy and I've been very privileged to have the opportunity of interviewing you tonight for our guest. We look forward not only to this book but for many more books to come. And any way that we can work with you and help you promote not only the books, but anything that we can do, please reach out, because we would be more than willing to do that. You are a part of the family, for sure.
Thank you so much. And you have really enriched my sense of family, Cynthia, and all of your colleagues at the Black Loyalist Heritage Society and Center. And thank you so much for everything, and for this friendship, and for welcoming me tonight. I wish you the best, and I can't wait to see you again in person when we have a chance to
That is
travel
right.
again.
That is right. Folks, thank you very much for attending tonight. We wish you all the best and how you move forward. Please, if you want any books, please phone the center at 902-875-1310. Our colleagues there, Kelly and Braden, will be more than willing to take your order, and we'll get the book shipped out to you. Again, we do have a postage that can go inside, and it does have Larry's signature there. And Larry, again, thank you so very much, giving off your time, sharing your thoughts and insights, answering the questions that were posed to you. We wish you all the best, and not only this novel, but for novels to come. And remember, you're always a friend of the family and the bigger family.
Thank you very much. We'll meet again.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.